Welcome to Human Powered, the podcast about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. I'm Trenton Moss, and today I have Ben Tye, CEO of Gate One. Ben, hello.
Hi, Trenton. Thanks for having me on the pod.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. So Gate One, obviously part of Havas, you're a growth transformation consultancy, a £50 million business with 300 people across 3 continents. So Ben, you're the CEO of the business, but you actually have 2 jobs. So 4 days a week, you work as CEO of Gate One, and 1 day a week, you're a psychotherapist. What has psychotherapy taught you that most CEOs probably don't know?
From an organisational or business perspective, there's 3 levels where I think it's really helped me in my role. The first is for me on a personal level. It's certainly made me a much better listener than I was throughout most of my career. And I've come to realise that giving someone your complete attention is a really great gift. And sometimes that's all that's needed, rather than jumping into giving an answer or finding a solution. Just being present and giving someone your complete undevoted attention is a great gift. Then I think on the second level is more about the individual. Look, we're not rational beings. Most of our behaviour isn't rational. It's emotional and oftentimes unconscious. We all carry our own life history in us and our future potential. And our job, the roles that we play are an important part of our identity. And when we're living and working in an environment such as we are now, where change is a constant, that sense of identity in the roles that we perform can sometimes feel threatened. So let me give you an example. We've all been in leadership meetings where one person is maybe being difficult, and the surface story there might be, okay, individual X is just being difficult or obstructive in some way, but actually sitting underneath that might be a real sort of felt loss of authority or anxiety about relevance, power and status, or that resistance or obstruction. They might be calling out something in the system itself that really merits further exploration. In the type of work that we do, transformation, which inevitably involves change, there's often lots of talk about resistance to change, and it's obviously sometimes framed as a bad thing that somehow needs to be addressed and overcome. And that's true, but also resistance to change can often reflect a deep concern about preserving something that's really important and valuable. So what I've learned is when behavior feels like irrational or incongruent in some way, like it's probably safe to assume that something unseen or below the surface is driving that. So the invitation there is to get curious before you get directive. And then the third level is around the kind of group and the system. And groups have both a conscious and an unconscious life. So every leadership team, every team operates on these 2 levels simultaneously. The stuff that's conscious is things like strategy, decisions, plans, agendas, actions, and decisions. But the unconscious life of a team or a group is often felt through power, dependency, anxiety. So a good example here is where you've got a leadership team or a group that's really having difficulty making a decision. And the question or what gets surfaced might be, okay, we need more data. And that may well be true. But sometimes that looking for something else outside of the group is surfacing maybe an unconscious or unknown fear of conflict or just a deep fear of being wrong. So you can often see common patterns in groups where the unconscious is driving more of the behavior and the performance than the conscious is. So it could be discomfort with the task at hand. It might be an unconscious of the avoidance of the challenge by packing the agenda with lots of items to avoid the difficult stuff. Perhaps looking for silver bullets. More data is often a frequent example. So what I've learned and through the training that I've done and the application of that, it's given me an opportunity to maybe, if not name, then at least ask the question about what might be happening below the surface. So if a team's stuck, rather than trying to solve the problem, it might be, what else are we not saying that might be influencing this situation, this difficulty that we're feeling in? And other watch outs are things like, let's take this offline. Sometimes that's necessary to protect confidentiality or privacy, but oftentimes, let's take this offline can be shorthand for this is too difficult for us. So let's take it out of this current environment because the anxiety or the challenge that we're feeling is too difficult in the moment. And another one is keeping an eye on the way that agendas get structured for significant board meetings or XComs, where it's not unusual to find the most difficult or challenging parts of the agenda somehow getting conveniently pushed back towards the end when there maybe isn't enough time to merit that discussion. So yeah, personal for me at the individual and then also at this group and system level.
So much there that I want to unpick, Ben. Maybe I want to start with that first part where you said giving someone your complete attention is a real gift. And rather than going in and trying to solve problems for people, it's about listening and creating the space for them to properly think things through and perhaps make new connections, new neurological pathways. Since making that change, what benefit have you seen to the people in your leadership team who you manage?
Both the therapy training and the coaching training gave me much better listening discipline. And I think before doing all of that, oftentimes previously I'd be listening for how I should respond rather than genuinely listening. And so rather than focusing on the content, there's often a lot of clues in the way that someone is feeling or thinking about something and the way that they're actually coming to you. In a one-to-one, typically people bring a problem that they're facing. And so by actively listening and asking more questions rather than jumping to an answer or a solution, it gives you the opportunity to surface more and surface about what assumptions are being made or what patterns are showing up or perhaps what's not being said. So it's helped me move from a position of kind of constantly advice giving to question asking. One thing we could all do is, if we're in those one-to-one situations where we are working with people, is to take a pause before trying to solve the problem and maybe ask one better next question instead of offering a quick answer. Now, I would counter that by saying, as a managing partner and CEO, sometimes I have to give advice, and I've got better at that actually over the last couple of years, getting the balance right, because you've got to be careful not to be a coach all the time, because that's what coaches are for. You also have a role as a leader, and making decisions and giving advice is part of that role. So holding those two things in balance, I think, is tremendously helpful.
Yeah, and I think you're right there about the balance. If you are constantly giving advice and suggesting to people what to do, you can create a culture of learned helplessness.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's, what does Ben think? I'll wait for him to give me the solution. That said, you do have wisdom and expertise that you're able to impart in people. It's getting that balance between supporting and mentoring and coaching to enable them to come up with a solution themselves. I'm curious, Ben, with this obviously change that you've gone through with your training and your other job, it's brought a different approach for you as a leader. How have you encouraged people in your leadership team and managers and leaders across the business to also engender this more coaching approach and not just telling people what to do?
We've been doing that for quite a few years, actually. We initiated a internal program where we trained people from across and up and down the organization in coaching. So we had a executive coach come in, train about 30 odd people from across the business who all wanted to become coaches. And so that style of interaction and open questioning is one that's not unfamiliar to us. And there are a number of people in the team, as well as me, particularly the members of the team who are focused on organisational and people change, fantastic coaches. So that kind of questioning and exploration is a style that most of us are actually familiar with. It's not something that I'm holding as a unique person in the business. That coaching mode of inquiry is one that's taught to all our line managers. It's how our account leaders work, and it's how our colleagues work with each other.
What do you think are the business benefits of that kind of approach?
Two lenses. One is, look, we're a people-based business. Consultancies can only thrive when people are able to do their best work, they're feeling heard, they're feeling represented, and they're developing. And so that sort of coaching style, as opposed to mentoring and training, which are, of course, absolutely necessary, it gives opportunity for people to feel heard and understood. So just in terms of what it's actually like to be here, I hope that that sort of style is something that's felt, and therefore people feel heard and feel seen and therefore feel valued by the business. And then the second thing is if you're not jumping to quick answers, it's more likely that you're wallowing in the problem a little longer, which is going to lead to better outcomes and better decisions, both for our clients and then also how we're growing and developing our own business.
Yeah, because as consultancies, we feel like our job is to solve problems. And it can sometimes be that goes into the culture, perhaps, that we try to solve these problems a bit too quickly.
Yeah, I also think the good thing about a sort of more coaching style, and maybe I'm over egging the pudding a little bit here, is it means that you don't have to know everything. And when working with clients, I've always said, and you'll hear my team say this all the time, curiosity is one of the biggest assets or the best attributes that you can have as a consultant, and in particular as a transformation consultant. Because if you're curious, it leads to better questions and a better understanding of some of the opportunities or challenges that you're trying to hold. And if you're curious, you're going to learn about your clients' businesses in the industries that they operate in. If you're curious, you're going to be bringing your own learning to your own professional development. And so curiosity and how that is then brought to life through the way that we engage with others is just a fantastic attribute to have as for any consultant or any leader.
Okay, so Ben, as a fellow executive coach, you're preaching to the converted here. I wonder, imagine I've never heard of executive coaching and I'm running a consultancy and I'm listening to this and I think, ooh, this is an interesting approach. What advice would you give to me to help me move my organization to have more of that coaching mindset?
Go and get a coach. I think you've got to experience it yourself. Unless you've experienced what good coaching really is, it's hard to then specify what the organization needs. If it's not something that you've experienced before, then go and find some. So I think if it's not something that you've done before or brought into the business, being clear about what problem or opportunity you're solving for, first of all. So why would this be a good thing to do? Improving performance, giving people development opportunities, particularly if you're a business that's growing quickly and people are taking on accountabilities or responsibilities that they've not taken on before, or new areas of development. Those are all ideal opportunities for bringing in some external help to inject that into the business. There's loads of accrediting organizations, and so it's not actually that difficult to identify a few willing champions, if you will. And they can go and do week-long or 3-day, 4-day programs that introduce some basic coaching models like the GROW model that are tremendously helpful. And then even beyond that, start doing a bit of a train the trainer approach. And then at the more senior levels, partnering up with a few good, credible executive coaches and then giving the leadership team the opportunity to take coaching as and when is something that would benefit them. That's a benefit in your team's personal and professional and career development.
Ben, you talked a little bit about growth there, about a growing consultancy. And I know from previous conversations, you've got quite lofty ambitions for the business. In fact, you want to double the business in size over the next few years. Tell me a bit about why you think growth is so important to a consultancy like Gate One.
So at the most kind of basic level, growth is about opportunity for people, career development, leadership roles, new challenges, a wider array of interesting clients and interesting work to do. Growth is about growing in all of those dimensions, and businesses that don't grow can stagnate and feel a bit samey. So growth allows new talent to come into the business. The growth that we've experienced internationally over the last 3 years, it's fantastic, right? Got team members in India and North America and France, and that's bringing a cultural diversity to Gate One that we didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. And then from a market perspective, clients increasingly need kind of end-to-end transformation partners and global partners. Many of our clients are some of the world's biggest businesses and organizations that operate in multiple countries. And so they need their transformation partners to have that global presence and global scale to work on their most pressing opportunities or challenges. And also from a feeling perspective, when firms stop growing, the kind of energy can turn a bit inwards. And I know we experienced that, and I experienced that last year when the UK consulting market was just really flat. It was very tough last year. We weren't really growing in the UK, although we were internationally. It brings that sort of inward focus and frustration. Consultancies have to grow in order to develop people's careers, hire new talent, surface increasingly complex and global client challenges and opportunities. And so it's not just about numbers, financial or commercial. It's about keeping the organization fresh, outward looking, and constantly evolving.
And you've got a large team, a globally diverse team, a very, as you talked about, culturally diverse team. How do you organize 300 people so they all go on that growth journey with you?
I think it's a mistake to think that you can align 300 people directly. So you've got to think about it through sort of layers and narratives and storytelling that gets told at different points throughout the organization. Over the last couple of years, it was clear that the way that we were organized and set up was almost becoming too big because we were one team, single P&L. We had communities of practice around industry sectors and capabilities, but we formalized those structures into a series of what we call bases. So we have 4 sector bases that face off to 4 different industry sectors. And then we have 3 practice bases, which is all about our craft and the work that we do and developing our careers within those practices. So we spent quite a long time thinking about what our strategy should be as we look from 2026 out to 2028, 2029. And we identified 4 pillars: impact, the impact that we're having on the world, so double the impact on our world; people, which is about attracting and developing and maintaining the best talent; 3 is about enablement, so tools, processes, platforms, systems, all the things that you need in order to be successful as a business. And if you do those 3 things right, then you'll get the growth. So we deliberately did it that way around, rather than saying, how big do we want to be? What are all the things that need to be true? Is actually what we're here to do. We're here to have an impact on the world. So let's start with that. Then we're a people business. So the next pillar is all about people, enablement, and that will then lead to growth. And so we set some high-level strategic objectives with some very clear outcomes and key results. We call those OKRs in each of those 4 pillars. And then what the teams have then done, so the leadership teams within each of those bases have then taken those 4 pillars and made it very relevant and appropriate to each of the bases. We have identified clear outcomes and key results, not just for 2028, but for 2026. And then we now run the business on a quarterly cycle against those strategic objectives at the group level, but also within each of the base teams, the sectors, the practices, and the geographies. And so hopefully within that, if you're a consultant who is sat in the digital and technology team in North America, you can see where your specific personal goals and objectives and contribution ladder up to the overall goals of the business. And so through adopting this outcomes and key results approach, I'm hopeful that the strategy for everybody, wherever you sit within the business, either a consultant or a member of the specialist functions team, can see what your role, can see your own role in the enabling and delivering the strategy of the business. I think don't underestimate the power of repetition. If you've sat within the kind of team that's formulating that strategy, it's quite easy for it to soak in, but don't underestimate the power of repetition. We had an all hands on Friday that was looking back at progress and performance year to date and look ahead. And we used the 4 pillars to structure the all hands and also check how it's being interpreted, not just communicated. So we've got a series of employee engagement networks that exist at each grade with representatives from the different countries and groups. So I don't think we do enough of that. I think we've got to get better at understanding how some of this kind of centrally driven broadcast communications is really being understood and internalized by members of the team. So I think we've got more work to do there.
It sounds like you've got your plan in place. You've realized the importance of repetition. You're continually talking about this with the business. And then everyone can always check in with how their base or how their geographic region is doing. And they can tie that back to what they're doing in their role to how they're impacting the strategy.
Yeah. And one of the simple hacks we did actually was we put it all into a massive mural. And so there's a mural that anybody can see on the business, and the 2028, 29 goals and outcomes and key results are all clear. They're then articulated into 2026's outcomes and key results. And then for each base, each sector, practice and geography and specialist function, there's some really clear outcomes and key results, not just for 2026, but for Q1 and for Q2. And then we can traffic light those in terms of how we're actually performing against it. So whether you're a new joiner coming into the business for the first time or someone who's been around for a while, you can take a look in the mural and it's, okay, how are we doing? How are we doing against what we said we were going to do?
So anyone in the business can immediately see where everything's tracking. I'm curious, on a kind of more practical level, how are you making sure that people really know that what they're doing day to day is funneling back up to this strategy to help you achieve the vision?
Everybody in Gate 1 goes through an annual process of setting objectives for the year. So now that we have formalized the bases, and those bases have a set of outcomes and key results, every individual in the business can set some very clear professional objectives that align with those, with the strategy, but also within the context of where they're operating, and no matter what stage of their career journey, their personal and professional development goals expressed in a series of objectives. And everyone in the business has a personal development lead, which is an elaboration of the line manager role. And importantly, within Gate 1, the PDLs are not aligned to the practices. And so you have a career coach effectively and a line manager who perhaps might sit outside of the line in which you're sitting. And what that hopefully means is we're not getting that siloed behavior that you get sometimes in other consultancies. And so your personal development you need is quite likely to be someone who's not in your account or in your base, but actually is someone elsewhere in the business who's taking a personal interest in your personal and professional development. Obviously, there's a formalized annual performance management process, but in between that, I would expect our personal and professional development leads, our PDLs, to be checking in with their people, maybe as frequently as once a week, but as a minimum every couple of weeks. So that's how it should work. It doesn't always work like that in practice. So we've got loads of work to do to continually evolve and keep improving things. But that's certainly the kind of intention and bar that we've set as a business.
Certainly the intention is excellent. And I'm curious, Ben, you've obviously talked about these bases quite a bit. I've never heard another business refer to business units as a base. How come you chose that term?
It would have been quite easy to just pick a name off the shelf. Lots of other consultancies talk about practices, and we chose the word base because a base is two things. A base is somewhere where you belong, somewhere where you can call home and have a sense of identity. But a base is also somewhere that you go forth from. So you go forth from your base to do your work. So our sector bases are those that are aligned to particular parts of the market, whether that's pharmaceuticals and healthcare or public sector, consumer, energy or financial services. And the consultants who sit within those sector bases obviously have an orientation towards that industry sector. They're developing and have that subject matter expertise that clients need. And then within the practice bases, that's more about the craft and the capabilities of the work that we do as consultants, whether that's digital strategy, whether it's customer experience, whether it's marketing transformation, organizational and people design, operating models, or transformation delivery. And that's where we can create the career pathways for people to become practitioners, then subject matter experts, and then leaders in their craft. And so that's why we chose the word base. Because it means something. It's a place to belong and a place from which you go forth from to do your work.
I really love that. A place we belong and a place you go forth from to do your work. So you've got this big growth ambition for the next few years. And a few years previously, you actually took over running the business after the original founders left. You had to transition the business from being founder-led to being part of a bigger business, part of Havas. What had to change? And then how did you transition everyone in the business through that change?
That's a great question. Firstly, I want to start by just acknowledging and saying what an amazing job our 4 founding partners did to start something around a kitchen table, to create Gate 1 with the ambition of consulting as it should be, as a real challenger brand to the big 4 and the incumbents. And we joined Havas at the very beginning of 2020. Just before the pandemic. And we had a 4-year integration. And so we were very deliberate during that period about what we would need to do and what we would need to be as a business now that we're part of the Havas group. And then the four founders completed that integration. And so founder transitions are big events, big deals for any professional services business. I've been through one before. And so there was some muscle memory there for me, I think, in terms of what to expect and what to anticipate. And so I'm a big fan of William Bridges' transitions model. And Bridges talks about in any big change, there are always three transitional phases that organizations go through. There's a period of endings, then there's this quite difficult and messy neutral zone before the new beginnings. And people often try and barrel through those things as quickly as possible without acknowledging the sort of necessary steps that any organization needs to go through. So the question that not just me, but the leadership team who'd all been brought through and developed and worked very closely with the founders, the sort of questions we were asking in terms of, okay, what do we need to preserve? What do we need to change? And what new things we needed to do? We wanted to preserve the values and ethos of Gate One. Gate One is a very values driven business. Our culture is an expression of those values. It's very low ego, very high EQ, collaborative and collegiate, close to our clients and close to one another. So those values and ethos we wanted to preserve. We were really clear we wanted to maintain mission integrity, global challenger transformation consultancy, focusing on really high value, meaningful transformation and not commoditized work. So we wanted to maintain the mission of the business as a place where people could come and do their best work. The entrepreneurial spirit that was threaded through the whole business right from the very beginning, whether that's in our incubator that allows people to pitch their own business ideas and spin up their own ideas, which we've had some amazing successes, but more broadly in the work that we do, kind of having that entrepreneurial approach, which is giving the freedom to try new things and take risks and not turn everything into a process. And there are some rituals, part of Gate One's DNA since the very beginning. So our gataways, where we get the whole business together once a year, and then each quarter, each of the regions have a full day together, connecting, doing work on strategy, perhaps doing some prototyping and incubating. It was a massive personal disappointment for me not be able to bring the whole global team together in 2025, but I'm delighted to say that we're going to be able to do that in 2026. Things like our CSR day, once a year we set aside a whole day to work with charities and bring charities in to help them with their work and volunteering. So values, ethos, mission integrity, entrepreneurial spirit, and those rituals were really important for us to preserve. And then what needed to change? So we needed to shift from a kind of very founder-led model where there's lots of kind of implicit or explicit permission seeking in order to do the work, to a more systemic, structured form of leadership and governance. So that meant much more clarity of decision rights and governance and trying to push accountability away from the center and a small group of people and to where the decisions are most effectively made, which is with the client teams, with the functions, scaling the leadership and the accountability beyond a smaller inner circle. And so being really clear about what it means to be a base leader or what it means to be an account leader, and bringing more differentiation between the specialist functions, whether that's people and talent, HR, marketing and growth, and finance and commercials, and the partners and the consultants and the leaders leading the business. So that's probably been one of the bigger changes, which is the shift in governance and decision making. And then I think hindsight's always a wonderful thing when you're looking at transitions, but I'll probably look back in a few years to come as 2024 being a year of endings, because we had people who had been literally the kind of lifeblood and the fabric of the business for 11 years moving on. And there's a tremendous sense of loss that comes with that. And so those endings take time to work through, and just acknowledging the sense of loss and perhaps a bit of a longing for once what was. And then 2025 being this kind of year of the neutral zone that was really compounded by a very difficult market, quite a lot of uncertainty. Where are we going? What's our direction? And the changes that I talked about earlier in terms of a very clear strategy, the organisational model and the operating model that we've put in place. 2026 does feel like that the start of that new beginnings phase that Bridges talks about in his transitions model. And the results this year have been pretty good. In fact, great so far in all of our geographies. So I think the tension, holding the tension during a transition period between keeping the energy of that entrepreneurial founder-led business whilst introducing the discipline of a more scaled global organization, plus being part of Havas. We'd been part of Havas for 4 years, but coming into 2024, fully shareholder owned by Havas. That carries certain accountabilities and responsibilities in terms of performance and expectations of the group. Great learning experience, very interesting time. And you throw AI into the mix, and it's a really interesting time to be a leader in any business, I think.
Absolutely. I want to just deep dive into one of the things you talked about there. You've shifted from being a founder-led business through to having much more structured leadership and governance, and in particular, more accountability across the business. Something that many consultancies struggle with is that accountability. There's perhaps too much learnt helplessness in many consultancies where we look to the leadership to take ownership, to take responsibility, to take accountability. Now, if I want to go through steps that you went through, and I want to get some advice from you, Ben, what advice would you give me as someone, say, running a business and wanting to get more accountability across my client teams and functions?
I think there's the kind of formal, visible stuff, which is, have you written this stuff down? Are there clear role descriptions and expectations at the different levels within the business? So you can point to, okay, this is what's expected of me as a senior consultant or as a director, for example. Getting clarity on that stuff. So writing down, what are the terms of reference for this particular governance group? What decisions are being made within this group, and constantly evolving those. So making that stuff as transparent as you can. But then there's the personal stuff. And I was preparing for today thinking in terms of my own journey as a leader and some of the things that I've had to unlearn as my career has progressed. Now, I trained as an engineer. I think historically I got my mojo from diving in, fixing problems, getting my hands dirty, getting stuff done, which is great and really helpful. But as a leader, that's the stuff you need to be pulling yourself away from, back to your point about dependency. And so I think on reflection, historically, I might have jumped in too quickly into some situations or needed to have an answer. And so we can sometimes unconsciously create dependency through our own behavior if we're a natural problem solver and a problem fixer. And so getting comfort with the discomfort of sitting back and allowing teams to work through the difficulties and challenges or whatever that they're working through without you diving in to fix it. Because what you're doing is actually you're inadvertently undermining the collective or individual leadership within that team as they're trying to work through things. Because if you're constantly diving in and putting the answers on the table and fixing things, you're taking away people's authority and accountability to work things through themselves, and you're creating this dependency loop. And then the second point I would add to that, as a leader, you need to go through these sort of stages of redundancy. And I don't mean that in the actual sense. What I mean is, as you're developing, you have a style or an approach that will take you to a certain point, but then that needs to change. And so if you find yourself feeling a little redundant because teams are solving problems, they're clear on what they're doing, you're not getting asked for advice, perhaps as much as you're used to, and not being pulled into things, rather than seeing that as a bad thing, it's probably a sign that you've done a really good job in terms of empowering people and giving them accountabilities. So then you need to shift your kind of thinking and way of working up to looking at the system itself rather than the tasks or the jobs to be done or the work at hand. It's pretty scary if your identity is fixed through your ability to solve problems and get shit done. When that's no longer necessary, what are you here to do? That requires a bit of inward looking, and back to what we talked about at the beginning, oftentimes the help of a really good executive coach to help you through that transition.
Yeah, it's a really great point about that kind of transition and how, as the business transitions, you need to keep transitioning and change your behavior.
We can't always get it right, and none of us are perfect human beings. We're all learning as we go along.
So, Ben, you've shared so many wonderful things with me today. I'm curious, what's next for you, and maybe a bit more about what's next for Gate One.
For Gate One, scaling and growing the business while protecting everything that makes Gate One distinctive, deepen our integration with Havas. And one of our priorities is bringing together the transformation, customer and marketing and AI capability to be able to really own that space within the market. And then for me, building and developing the next generation of leaders such that, back to that redundancy thing, I can hand over the baton to a new generation of leaders at some point in the future. And then for me personally, I really enjoy this work. It sits at this sort of really interesting intersection of leadership, systems thinking, human behavior, together with the kind of the pace and the speed that is demanded of a commercial business. I think I need to spend a bit more time and effort on working with my leadership teams to help leaders within the business, to help them develop and pull back a bit further from some of the doing. I want to have a bit more of an outward-facing role. Transitions are demanding and they require a lot of inward-facing. And from the midpoint of the year, I'd like to be a bit more out in the market, acting as an ambassador for the business and helping clients understand what transformation really means in this day and age. I'm enjoying the work, enjoying the journey that we're on. It's a great place to be at this moment in time.
Fantastic. What a lovely way to end the conversation. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time out to join me today. It's been so interesting hearing everything you've got to say.
Thank you, Trenton. It's been a real pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation and the questions you've pitched at me. So thanks for having me on the pod.
You've been listening to Human Powered, the podcast all about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. Thanks for tuning in.